So perhaps before we come to the exact conception, which is a huge part of it, and childhood, all of those things you've said seem so associated with modern society. As you say, our society is increasingly desperate to escape isolation and dismay of our daily lives. It's rife with addiction. Consumer society is rife with addiction. We're presented with this fast-moving consumer culture. There's everything there to kind of fill any void we have. So do you point the finger at that culture that we live in? You know, it drives us to be addicts of whatever form. You know, is that human nature, or is that very much exacerbated by this culture that we live in?
Well, in the book I'm currently writing, The Myth of Normal, I have a chapter on human nature. And we tend to identify human nature with our own behaviors. We're not aware that in different circumstances create different human beings with a totally different nature. So this society does two things. It denies some basic human needs for meaning and for contact and for autonomy on the one hand. On the other hand, whole industries are based on distracting ourselves from the pain that follows from that denial. And so that so much of the economy is based on distracting people from the pain of existence in this culture. Somebody wrote a book with a very astute title a couple of decades ago called When Society is an Addict. And it's exactly the point that you raised.
So do you look at society today and think that in essence we are all, it's almost impossible to live in such a society and not be an addict, because how is it even possible to find that sort of normality, or whatever you would define it as, freedom in a society such as ours?
It is possible under two circumstances. One is rare, which is that you have the kind of conception, gestation, and upbringing that really keeps you connected to meaning and your true self. It happens. There are such people. More commonly, it's still possible to not to be seduced by the addictive blandishments of this culture, but it takes a high degree of consciousness and awareness. And that takes work. Believe me, talking personally, that takes a lot of work. Not that I'm a finished product by any means, but it's taken me a lot of work, and everybody that I know, to become aware and conscious, and therefore not to have to move to fill this void, as you say, automatically and compulsively. That takes, in this culture, a lot of awareness. In this culture where so much is designed to take you away from yourself and to create false needs to fill the void that the culture itself created.
And similarly, as a culture, I mentioned at the beginning, I was sorry we couldn't be in the same room. I know that you are sorry we can't be in the same room. We can't see each other. There's a disconnectedness that no one can deny. That's obviously been exacerbated hugely by what we're all going through at the moment. So when you put those two things together, society, again, the sort of an isolated society now exacerbated by the coronavirus, which keeps us all in our own homes. We're not able to see people. How much of a devastating effect does that have on increasing illness, of course, and addiction?
Well, as you in Britain might know, the loneliness epidemic, they call it. It's interesting how we put everything in disease terms, but the loneliness epidemic has got to the point where your government has appointed a minister of loneliness. A minister of loneliness. That's before COVID. And with the increasing isolation that COVID has imposed, we've seen an increase in drug use and in domestic violence, babies being battered, all the traumas that later on will then further lead to addiction.
you talk about babies being battered and those sorts of traumas, as you refer to a lot in the book, as you've referred to already in this talk, support for parents, support for parenting, and just generally the importance of the childhood experience is of course central to everything that you talk of. And again, do you see that as something that society now is not as good as at promoting as it once was? So, you talk about past days when we were part of communities and tribes and parenting was something very different. And that is perhaps the most important root of an increased population of addicts, as you say.
Well, if we just look at, if you had a garden, if you had an English country garden, and you were cultivating it and growing plants, and some of these plants weren't growing well, and they were kind of scrawny and misshapen, you could accuse them of being derelict and yell at them to grow up already. Or you could say, what conditions are lacking here? Nutrition, sunlight, irrigation, so on, space, and so on. In our society, we see increasing number of people being addicted, being depressed, increasing number of children being anxious, being diagnosed with all manner of so-called medical conditions like ADHD and so on, which I've also written about. But instead of asking ourselves, well, what's wrong with the conditions that these children are developing in, we're actually pathologizing these kids and saying they have a disease of some kind. Now let's look at the environment. If you look at how human beings evolved, how we actually evolved, we evolved as communal creatures. We could not have evolved otherwise. So before there were our species walked the earth, there were pre-humans or other humans and their ancestors. And so for millions or hundreds of thousands of years, and for most of the existence of our own species, which seemed to arise about 150, 200,000 years ago, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groups where children were surrounded by many adults who parented them as their own kids. So there was what's called allo-parenting, where others would also parent each child. Not a question of each nuclear family separated in their own little cave, and then the baby had its own cave, can you imagine? Or its own little hut. No, kids were always together with adults. They were picked up and held all the time. When Aboriginal peoples are studied in small band hunter-gatherer groups, which is how we lived for most of our existence, kids are not left to cry on their own. They're picked up all the time. They're not hit.